Hi everyone. Today I'll be talking about Bach as the guiding force behind Prelude and Fugue over time. Bach was not the first, nor the last, to compose in the form of Prelude and Fugue, but his devotion to the form was crafted with such balance and beauty that it's hard to not view the Preludes and Fugues before Bach as simply leading to a culmination in his well-tempered Clavier, and viewing the Preludes and Fugues after Bach as being a reflection of his masterful works. Composers after Bach, such as Mendelssohn, Shostakovich, and Kapustin, wrote sets of preludes and fugues using compositional devices inspired by Bach's well-tempered Clavier. These include the use of motivic material, manipulation of the fugue subject, and the relationship of a prelude to its fugue. Cecile Gray, a music critic and composer, said, "The greatest masters come at the end of a long period of development and are for the most part content to accept the conventions and procedures of their predecessors, which they merely bring to an ultimate point of perfection. Bach is generally pointed to as a supreme example of this type of artist." Let's look at some of Bach's predecessors. In Italy in the early 1600s, Girolamo Frescobaldi was writing toccatas, which served as preludes to larger pieces. The toccatas had contrasting sections, including dense counterpoint, and influenced Bach's early chorale preludes for organ. Later in the 1600s in Germany, Dietrich Buxtehude was also writing pieces with contrasting sections of free improvisation and strict counterpoint, as seen in his preludes. This foreshadows Bach's contrast between a prelude and fugue. In 1702, Johann Caspar Ferdinand Fischer wrote a set of 20 preludes and fugues for pipe organ, entitled Ariadne Musica, written in 10 major and 9 minor keys in the Phrygian mode. Also in Germany at this time, Georg Böhm was writing many preludes and many fugues. Bach was known to study his music, and was also known to study the music of Georg Philipp Telemann, whose works included 48 chorale preludes and 20 small fugues for organ. All of this preceded Bach's writing of his prelude and fugue sets, known as the well-tempered Clavier. The two sets each have 24 prelude and fugue pairs in every major and minor key. They celebrated the new well-tempered tuning system, in which all keys sounded in tune, as opposed to the mean tone temperament system of that time. Bach published Book 1 in 1722 in Cothen, Germany, and Book 2 in 1742 in Leipzig, Germany. Cecile Gray said, "It is the 48 preludes and fugues which best exemplify the amazing duality of Bach's genius, both its passéism and its futurism. In some numbers, we feel the pull of the tradition which goes back through Palestrina to the Netherlanders, and from them to Gregorian chant itself. In others, we hear the tones and accents of the modern world, and a hint of those of the music that is yet to come." Let's look at the music that came after Bach's preludes and fugues. Some composers followed in Bach's tradition to write a set of 24 preludes in all major and minor keys, such as Chopin, Scriabin, Rachmaninoff, Debussy, Shostakovich, and Kapustin. Other composers followed Bach even more closely, writing sets of 24 preludes and fugues. These include Czerny, Shostakovich, Schedrin, Nordenstein, Slonimsky, Madsen, and Kapustin. Other composers who wrote substantial sets of preludes and fugues, though not 24, include Mendelssohn, Clara Schumann, Huber, and Kovalevsky. In this lecture recital, I will analyze and perform preludes and fugues by Bach, Shostakovich, Kapustin, and Mendelssohn. Let's start with Shostakovich. Shostakovich was a Russian composer who lived from 1906 to 1975. In 1948, Shostakovich's music was denounced by the Communist Party for political incorrectness. He was dismissed from Moscow Conservatory and conformed to political pressures to compose officially approved musical works. In 1950, Shostakovich went to Germany for the ceremony surrounding the 200th anniversary of Bach's death. This included a piano competition in which Shostakovich sat on the jury and heard Tatyana Nikolaeva play Bach's well-tempered Clavier. This inspired him to compose a similar work. That same year in Moscow, at a time when abstract composition in the Soviet Union was a dangerous venture, Shostakovich wrote 24 preludes and fugues, opus 87, which was dedicated to and premiered by Nikolaeva. Perhaps his homage to Bach helped him through the political repression and provided relief from his politically commissioned works. To better understand how Bach's compositions influenced Shostakovich, we will compare Bach Prelude and Fugue in F major from Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 2, number 11, with Shostakovich Prelude and Fugue in A major, opus 87, number 7. We will explore three main aspects: how both preludes are structured similarly, with the reprisal of a main theme throughout; how the motivic material in the bridge of both fugues exposition act as the building block for all of the episodic material and its rhythmic counterpoint; and how both preludes establish the harmonic progression of key areas and hint at devices used more fully in the fugue. In Bach's prelude, he sets up the key on the downbeat and then begins the theme on the upbeat. After each cadence, a new section begins with the theme. Bach always uses the end of the cadence to act as the beginning of the new section, which creates a sense of continuity between sections. Here is the transition between the perfect cadence in C and the reprisal of the theme. In Shostakovich's Prelude, he also sets up the key on the downbeat and begins the theme on the upbeat. The theme comes back with altered pitches, but the same rhythm and basic shape. Like Bach's Prelude, each cadence is followed by the theme, and the end of each cadence is also the beginning of a new section. The fugues of the preludes we just saw also establish thematic or motivic material in the opening that is seen throughout the rest of the fugue. In Bach's fugue exposition, the subject's strong pulse on the beat is contrasted with the suspensions introduced in the bridge, which create a rhythmic fluidity across the bar line. The bridge is made of a motivic rhythm. Starting at the bridge, listen to how this motivic rhythm is staggered with itself and with the subject to create rhythmic counterpoint, where each voice is clearly heard in the silence of the other. Bach continues to use this motivic rhythm to furnish the material for all of the Fugues episodes. In the first episode, we see this motive playing against itself. Shostakovich also introduces motives in the bridge of his fugue exposition that become the building blocks for the fugue's episodic material. Like Bach, these motives create rhythmic variety against the subject and are able to play against each other to create rhythmic counterpoint that allows each voice to be heard. This Shostakovich fugue in A major has no non-harmonic chord tones, but always stays within the harmony presented. The rhythmic variety then creates different textures on these pure harmonies. 4 motives introduced in the bridge. Motive 1, motive 2, motive 3, and motive 4 form the rest of the fugue's episodic material. In the second episode of this fugue, you can again hear the balance of rhythm between the motives as they play against each other in different patterns. Both Bach and Shostakovich use the prelude to establish the key and hint at rhythmic devices that are developed more fully in their respective fugue. Bach uses pedal point to anchor the key on tonic F, and later in the piece on dominant C. Bach uses pedal point on these same notes in the fugue as well. He is also using the device of suspended rhythms that we saw developed in the fugue. Shostakovich is also using the prelude to establish the harmonies used in the fugue. Here he uses pedal point on A, and later in the piece on E, F sharp, and C sharp, which are the same pedal points he uses in the fugue. We also see the use of eighth notes leaping on triads, suspended rhythm, and a dotted quarter note against eighth notes, which are all rhythmic devices we saw developed in the fugue. Shostakovich takes the connection between the prelude and fugue even one step further than Bach, by ending the prelude with only a weak cadence and writing an attacca to begin the fugue right away without pause. Next, let's look at how Kapustin also used the composing techniques of Bach in his preludes and fugues. Nikolai Kapustin is a living Russian composer and pianist born in 1937 who graduated from Moscow Conservatory. His website defines him as a classical composer who happens to work in a jazz idiom. He fuses these influences in his compositions, using jazz idioms in formal classical structures. In 1997, he wrote 24 preludes and fugues, Opus 82. From this Opus 82 set, we will compare Prelude and Fugue in B minor number 8 with Bach's Prelude and Fugue in E flat or D sharp minor from Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1, number 4. We'll look at 4 main aspects: the similarity between Bach's and Kapustin's fugue subjects that lends itself to stretto, augmented stretto used in both to create climax, Kapustin's use of double fugue, and comparing how the motivic material of the prelude foreshadows the fugue subject. Both of these fugues are highly subject-based as opposed to being episode-based. This means the majority of these 2 fugues are statements of the subject in its original, inverted, or augmented form, and often used in stretto. In order to have such a subject-based fugue, the composer has to have a subject that is malleable enough to create suitable harmonies even when inverted or in stretto, and can create rhythmic counterpoint with itself, where each voice can still be heard independently. The opening 4 notes of Bach and Kapustin's fugue subjects are identical in interval and rhythm. Each moves from tonic to dominant, and then up a half step that leads back to the dominant. They each have the same rhythm of a quarter note, dotted quarter note, and 2 eighth notes. When these subjects are used in stretto, the pitches and rhythms will align to create harmonic progressions and rhythmic counterpoint. In this passage where Bach uses stretto, notice how the pitches and rhythms align to create pleasing harmonies and rhythmic independence of the lines. Notice how Kapustin's use of the subject in stretto also creates rhythmically independent lines and interesting harmonies. Kapustin also uses Bach's compositional device of augmenting the rhythm of the subject, while in stretto with the original subject, in order to create climax near the end of a fugue. In this passage, Bach is using this technique just before the fugue's coda. Kapustin uses the augmented subject in stretto for climax near the end of his fugue as well. Kapustin's fugue uses two subjects, which is known as a double fugue. This is Kapustin's second subject. Bach also composed many double fugues. In Bach's double fugues, he introduces the first subject in all the voices before the end of the exposition. However, Kapustin does not do this, but rather uses the first and second subject interchangeably in the voices. In the exposition, Kapustin introduces subject 1 in the bass voice, subject 1 in the alto voice, and then subject 2 in the soprano voice, as though subject 2 is replacing subject 1. Subject 1 does not appear in the soprano voice until late in the piece. Kapustin is taking the form of double fugue, which Bach solidified, and using it differently by developing both subject 1 and subject 2 simultaneously. In only one of Bach's preludes and fugues does the fugue subject appear in the prelude in an obvious way. In most of Bach's preludes and fugues, only hints can be found when looking in detail. For example, in the Bach fugue we've been analyzing, the fugue subject, when altered as a tonal answer and with an altered rhythm of an eighth note instead of a quarter note, has the same intervals and rhythm found in the opening motive of its prelude. This only happens once in the fugue and is a hidden connection to the prelude that most people would not hear right away. Kapustin, however, incorporates the motives used in his prelude into his fugue subject in a very audible way. These are only some examples from the prelude. Notice the highlighted yellow notes and see if you can hear the fugue subject. All of these motives from the prelude are combined in the opening of Kapustin's fugue subject. Like Shostakovich and Kapustin, Mendelssohn also followed Bach's model of prelude and fugue while molding it to his own style. Felix Mendelssohn was a German composer who lived from 1809 to 1847. He was an advocate for popularizing Bach's works during his lifetime. Mendelssohn's respect for Bach is shown in a comment he made about a new telescope that had people saying how insignificant humans would appear to extraterrestrial beings. He said, yes, but the well-tempered clavier would certainly instill respect in them. In 1837, he published 6 Preludes and Fugues, opus 35. They combine neo-Baroque counterpoint with romantic writing styles more familiar to the audience of his time. We will look at the first Prelude and Fugue from this set. The Fugue was written in 1827 at the bedside of his dying friend. The Fugue embodies conflict and distress, and later spiritual enlightenment, perhaps inspired by his friend's struggle and passing from this world. The accompanying prelude was added 10 years later in 1837. We will explore 4 main aspects of the piece: how Mendelssohn introduces the motives used throughout the entire fugue in the fugue exposition, how he introduces outside influences different from the character of the exposition as the fugue develops, his use of a second exposition of the inverted subject, and the relationship between his prelude and fugue. Like Bach, Mendelssohn uses the fugue exposition to expose the motives and textures used throughout the rest of the fugue. Looking at the subject, we already sense harmonic tension, ambiguity, and non-resolution, foreshadowing what is to come. After beginning in tonic, Mendelssohn moves to the diminished 7th chord, outlining a tense tritone. Then immediately goes to another 7th diminished chord, now in the subdominant, resolves to the subdominant, but lingers on a non-harmonic chord tone appoggiatura for added tension, and ends the subject on a dominant 7th chord without resolving the leading tone. It feels unsettled. For the first part of the fugue, Mendelssohn maintains the individuality of all 4 voices, as we just heard in the exposition. The rhythmic motive of an upbeat 8th note to a longer note duration is heard throughout the rest of the fugue. The 16th notes in the opening of the subject are also developed to a large extent later on. As the fugue develops, the rhythmic individuality of the 4 voices is lost. The voices begin to function more as a single chordal rhythmic unit against 16th notes. In this passage, we can see the development of devices from the exposition, such as the rhythmic motive, accented passing tones, which, like the appoggiatura from the subject, place non-chord tones on strong beats, and the continuation of harmonic tension, ambiguity, and non-resolution. Beginning in B minor, there's a brief tonicization of the 4th degree E that unexpectedly resolves to the 6th degree G major. Then we finally seem to cadence back to B minor, but it is only an elided cadence that keeps going until we finally cadence again, but on a deceptive 6-7 G major chord. To make things even more unsettled, Mendelssohn adds accelerando. Like Bach, we hear Mendelssohn developing the exposition material. However, unlike Bach, he also adds energy and influences from outside of what is presented in the exposition, such as drastic changes in tempo, a flurry of 16th notes, and a loss of the 4-voice counterpoint. Later in the fugue, he even adds a chorale in major that seems to come from nowhere. Bach's fugues retain a sense of balance in character, rhythm, and motivic content, where everything seems to stem from itself organically, never seeming to come from nowhere, but always having a basis in the opening material. Mendelssohn, on the other hand, seems to have a sporadic energy that he can't contain, even when it strays from the opening material. Right after this deceptive cadence, Mendelssohn introduces the inverted subject in all four voices, creating a second exposition. In the entry of each voice, you can see the ambiguity of voice position. For example, in the first tenor entry, the voice begins in alto position, but moves to soprano after half a measure, even though it is still functioning as the tenor voice in the larger structure of the exposition. This is the same Bach fugue in D-sharp minor that we compared with Kapustin's. Bach also created an exposition of the inverted subject, composed a century before Mendelssohn. Unlike Mendelssohn, notice how Bach always retains the rhythmic individuality and positioning of all three voices. Like Bach's Preludes and Fugues, Mendelssohn's Prelude also establishes the key and hints at rhythmic devices used in the fugue, such as the flurry of fast notes against a melody. After looking at how Mendelssohn, Shostakovich, and Kapustin use motivic material, manipulate the fugue subject, and connect the prelude to the fugue, we can see how their procedure is rooted in the genius of Bach. Prelude and Fugue was the outcome of Bach's free-spirited development of thematic material, which led to much variety within his works. Some of his preludes and fugues are precise and others free-flowing. Some are episodic, while others are subject-based. Some are meditative, while others are dance-like. His genius was in the procedure of developing material, and in the composers after him, we also see the ability to develop ideas freely within the organized structure of prelude and fugue. Please join me as I perform these 5 preludes and fugues.